Welcome to the Liberty Baptist Sermon Archives. The message you're about to hear was preached at Liberty Baptist Church in Easton, Massachusetts. You can find out more about us or contact us at mylibertybaptist.org or just look us up on Facebook. And now we hope that this message from God's Word will be a blessing to you.
Please turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter number 9 this morning with a message I've entitled this, Eyes on the Prize. Eyes on the Prize. One of my favorite places to study in the entire world is the Boston Public Library. I love being able to go there about every month or so. I go down to Copley Square and study there, put together sermons and outlines and such, and it's just a really good time to be able to focus and get away from distractions and to be able to do some long-term sermon preparation and reading and such. One of the places I love to study is in the old reading room in the McKim building. I don't know how many of you have ever been there before, but they don't make buildings like that anymore. I mean, it's absolutely incredible when you go in there and you see how ornate it is, and it's the oldest public library in the world, and it's just an amazing place to be. But there's actually a place, a lot of times I like to study even more than that, and it's in the newer building, and it's right against Boylston Street, and there's a table that's there. If I was to take you in my mind, I can go there right now. But there's a table that faces a very large window off of Boylston Street. And if I was to sit on that high-back chair and I sit at that table and look out the window, not only do I see all the activity on Boylston Street, but I also see this, the finish line of the Boston Marathon. I mean, it's there all year. It's not just there on the day in April when they run the Boston Marathon. It's literally painted there. Every day of the year, they repaint it and refresh it before the next race. But I like just sitting there perched over the finish line of the Boston Marathon. In many ways, that's the closest I'll ever get to the finish line of the Boston Marathon is by studying in the library, because I am not in any condition or shape or desire to ever run in the Boston Marathon. But, you know, as I look at that finish line and I consider that finish line, you think of people that you've seen on TV that have run the Boston Marathon. They don't just run across the finish line. There are some who walk across the finish line. There are some who crawl across the finish line. There are people openly weeping when they cross the finish line, because crossing the finish line represents a whole lot more than just crossing the finish line. What they have done on that day, that Patriot Day in April of that year, what they've been doing for over 115 years, I think 130 years now, that they've been running the Boston Marathon. What happens on that day as they cross the finish line represents something far greater. See, there's been an investment that has been made by those runners that took place before the day of the Boston Marathon. See, they got up early. They got up at 3 or 4 in the morning. For what reason? Why would you want to do that? Well, because they're getting ready to train. They're running in rain. They're running in snow. They're putting things into their bodies that they may not want to eat or they may not want to drink, but they're doing so for one reason and one reason only, because there's a prize at the end of the Boston Marathon, and they want to be able to cross that finish line. They want to receive that medal. They want to be able to say for the rest of their lives that they are not just a qualifier, but they are a finisher in the race, the most prestigious race maybe in the world, the Boston Marathon. But as we go forward in our daily walk, and as we try to talk about the very basics of what it means to be a Christian and why it's important for us to not just be nominal Christians or just to call ourselves believers, but not to truly move forward as disciples of Christ, Paul brings up in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 the thought that there are those who will go to extraordinary lengths to win a crown for something that has very little meaning for eternity. But yet when you consider the race that God has called us to run, that was just sung about just a few moments ago, many of us are not willing to give the investment. Many of us don't even see the importance in running a race that doesn't just have earthly implications, but that also has eternal implications as well. And so I want us to consider this morning that a race with higher importance requires a higher investment from those who run the race. A race with higher importance requires a higher investment from those who run the race. And that may not make sense to us right now, but I'm hoping by God's grace in the next few minutes that we'll understand why we need to move forward for Christ. It's not just about what we do here, it's because there's a finish line that's ahead. Would you stand please for the reading of God's Word, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse number 24. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24. Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run, that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly. So fight I, not as one that beateth, the air. But I keep under my body, and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Be seated, if you will, and we'll ask the Lord to bless the reading of His Word and the preaching of His Word here today. Now, when Paul would have talked in terms of sports here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it's likely something that would have perked up the ears of those who were Greeks there who lived in Corinth. Sporting events are not just big in our day, they were big in the days of Paul and of the Greeks and the Romans as well. And the city of Corinth was the center of the Isthmian Games. And the Isthmian Games, which means nothing to us today, but would have meant a great deal to those who lived in Greece at those times, because compared to the Olympic Games, which at that time were the premier games of all of the known world, the Isthmian Games would have been just second to the great elaborate nature and that of the Olympics. But what was interesting about these games was that there was no gold or silver or bronze like they are today. Now, we're used to seeing the medals being handed out. We're used to seeing the three people standing on the platform and the national anthem being sung or being played of the winning nation, while the other two stand there as well. But that's not the way those modern Olympics and those ancient Olympics and ancient Isthmian Games would have been. The victor's prize was very simple. It was a pine wreath that was to go around the head. In the Isthmian Games, that was important because it was given in honor of Poseidon, the Greek god. And so they would have, these Corinthians, these people of Corinth, would have been very familiar with the imagery that Paul is using here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because maybe they had not participated in those games, maybe they had not watched them on ESPN, but they had probably likely seen them in person and known, at least if anything else, the cultural significance of these sporting events, that it wasn't just sport, it was life. It wasn't just sport, it was life. Now, could we probably say something similar about sports today? That for some, it's not just sports, it's life. It's not just a ball going over a wall or in a hoop or a ball going through goalposts. But there are some who already, in certain cities around this country, are already preparing themselves and getting themselves geared up for games that will take place later today to determine who goes into the Super Bowl. Sports is life. And so Paul uses this imagery here, and he uses the imagery of a race, but also the imagery of a boxing match as well. Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 to say this, he says, sports may be life here on this earth to many, but there is a greater life that one must consider when they're a believer. And there may be a prize in this life that's great for those who win the sporting events, but there is a prize that is greater for those who run the Christian race that God has called us to run. And Paul uses this imagery and this example of those who literally give their entire bodies just to be able to win a prize. And we're familiar with this today because sports science, because those kind of things have advanced to such a degree that it is a very unusual thing to see an athlete that is unfit. In fact, quite the opposite. Most athletes today are almost overfit in a lot of ways when you consider someone like a Tom Brady, who's 70 years old right now, still playing football, something like that. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, but he's still playing football, and he has this regimen. And I printed it out, and I'm not going to read it, but the regimen of things that he does just to be able to make his body prepared at age 46, all joking aside, at age 46 to play football, he literally lives, breathes, eats football. You're not sure about that? Just ask Giselle. She will tell you that he lives, breathes, and eats football. Why? Because he wants to win a Lombardi trophy. Well, he wants to win another Lombardi trophy. You say, well, maybe, 5 will be enough. He wants to win another trophy. I have here a list of things that LeBron James does when he gets prepared for the playoffs, knowing that over an 82-game season, he's played more games in the NBA than any other player in history because he started right out of high school. He started playing at a very high level when he was very young. He's now in his late 30s, and he's still playing NBA basketball at a fairly high level. But to do so over 82 games, not counting the playoffs that he's usually a part of every year as well, takes a toll on the body. So he goes through this incredible regimen. I have it right here of cold tubs and stretching and rehydration and practices and massages and a 3-hour nap. I'll tell you this, I can get involved in that. A 3-hour nap, where do I sign up for that? I'll train like LeBron James if that's what it takes. The rest of it, I'm not so sure, but the 3-hour nap sounds very appealing. But he does all of it. Why? Because everything has to come together to game day. And every game day is about one thing: winning the Larry O'Brien Trophy, which is the end result of winning the NBA championship. And these people, these men and women, will literally have their whole lives surrounded about the fact that they want to win a trophy, that they want to win a medal, that they want to win something of some nature, but which the Bible calls corruptible, meaning this: it's of this earth. That it's something that has no lasting permanence. As such, that if I was to ask you, who won the NBA championship 6 years ago, most of us wouldn't know. If I was to say, who won the Super Bowl 10 years ago, most of us wouldn't know. If I was to say, who won the 1974 World Series, probably none of us would know. But these are things that at the time, people are willing to give everything for. There are some that I believe, and there have been stories written about it, that would sell their soul to win a championship, to be looked at as the best, to be looked at on top. And if I was to summarize just these verses that we read here, Paul is saying this: if people are willing to invest to that level for something that really doesn't matter, why won't we, in the race that God has called us to run, invest of everything for something that counts for everything? And it's an important question. And it's a real question. And it's one that we, I believe, struggle with on a daily basis. So with the understanding of what athletes of the past and the present do to enable themselves to perform at peak efficiency, we should consider ourselves and our lives today. Paul tells believers that to be our best for the Lord, there are some things about our walk that we are to understand that should be higher and better than what the sports stars do here in this world. In fact, he says several things. In verse 25, he says, we have a higher purpose. Looking at verse number 24 rather, it says, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that you may obtain. So while people will run an earthly race to win a prize, Paul immediately grabs the attention of the Corinthians to tell them that they need to run and they need to obtain as well. Not running as if they're going to run in the Isthmian Games or the Olympian Games or anything of that nature. He says, no, there is a higher purpose that you have. There's a different kind of race that you have to run. The Corinthians would watch the Isthmian races and think it was something that they couldn't obtain. But yet Paul says this: there is something even greater for you to consider. You may think, oh, wow, I could never run like that, or I could never kick a ball like that, or I could never drive a golf ball like that. I could never do that like those people do. And maybe we look at those things on television, or we listen to them on the radio, and we think that. But Paul says, you may not be able to do that, but there's something you can do, and it's far greater than what they do. So give yourself to this, because there is a higher purpose. We've talked about this for the last 3 weeks, about going forward. But I have to ask you, has it moved you? Have you thought about it? Have you thought about growth in your Christian life? Have you thought about the fact that there are souls who are counting on us, that they're outside that we've never met, that there are souls who are counting on us that are right here within our families, that there are souls who are counting on us that maybe within your peer groups, friends at school that you may know, that they are counting on us, and we just look at it like it's no big deal. But he says this: if the sportsman will give his life for a trade and for a craft that means nothing for eternity, then why can't we give ourselves for the higher purpose and the higher calling of Jesus Christ? But he says not only do we have a higher purpose, but we also have a higher prize. Look at verse 26. Verse number 25, rather. I'm off. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now, we'll look at that again in a moment. Now, they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. That term corruptible means it's earthly, it's temporary. And Paul says that people will go to extraordinary lengths to win a trophy, but yet it's corruptible. Listen, trophies can break. I was looking at some stories this week. Every major championship, the 4 major sports that we have in the United States, football, baseball, basketball, and hockey, all of their championship trophies sometime in the last 30 to 40 years have been broken. Last year at one college football bowl game. You know there's too many bowl games, by the way, when one's named for a mayonnaise company. There was the Duke's Mayo Bowl game last year, which just tells me there's far too many of these things. What happened to the Orange Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, and all those things? The Rose Bowl, the Duke's Mayo Bowl. They were partying with the trophy for the Duke's Mayo Bowl, which I guess was just a big bottle of mayo. I don't know what it was. And somebody dropped it on television and shattered the whole thing. They dropped the whole mayo. What are you going to do? It's a corruptible trophy. It can shatter. It can break. Trophies can be taken away. Do you know that there are college football athletes and sometimes even professional athletes that win championships or win personal prizes and they get stripped of those prizes later on? There are Heisman Trophy winners in college football that had their Heisman trophies stripped from them. They are no longer the winner. Some of you will remember the White Sox back almost 100 years ago, but the Black Sox scandal where they cheated in playing baseball and all of a sudden they were stripped of the World Series which they had won. See, trophies can be taken away. Trophies can be auctioned away. You ever watched sports stars of yesteryear that ran out of money? That didn't have the money that they thought they would have in savings, and certainly up until not too long ago, sports stars making millions and millions of dollars was an unusual thing. It's not so unusual now. You sit on a bench and you can make $1 million playing sports now. But there were those who took trophies, championship rings, and auctioned them away. They sold them. They can be sold, they can be shattered, they can be taken away. But there's something that we run for that's more important than a Lombardi trophy, and it's more important than a Stanley Cup or a finisher's medal at the Boston Marathon. You see, for the Christian, there are crowns that will be awarded after we cross the finish line of this life. Yes, you and I someday, whether we want to think about it or not, are going to cross the finish line of this life. We don't know the day, we don't know the hour, but whether God calls us home or Jesus Christ comes back, however it may be, we're going to cross that finish line. And after we do, there's crowns, the Bible says, that will be handed out, 1 Peter 1:4, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. You see, there are things in heaven that are reserved for us that won't fade away. When the things of the earth fade away, when the trophies of this world have no meaning in the long term, the things that we do for God, listen, we have a higher prize. And we have to keep that in mind. There's a higher purpose. There's a higher prize. We also have a higher confidence. Look at verse number 26. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly. So fight I, not as one that beateth the air. And Paul uses the imagery here of a race, but he also uses the imagery of a fight. You know, boxing matches, doing some reading and study this week in the Olympian times and the Isthmian Games, would have been so brutal as to be unrecognizable to us today. That matches could have gone literally hours as they brutalized themselves until someone was either mostly dead or dead. That they wouldn't have boxing gloves on, but literally they would sometimes put implements on their hands to be able to inflict damage into the other person as they fought. But Paul uses these types of images to say, I run, but I run and give my best effort. I fight, but I make sure that I'm connecting with my punches. See, because someone can run and not give it their all. Or someone can fight and not connect. But Paul says this, we have a higher confidence because of what God does for us. When we run with certainty. And when we fight with certainty. Because, our higher purpose and our prize should give us a higher confidence. We should desire to perform in this arena because of what's at stake. You know what we shouldn't have to do? We shouldn't have to try to trick Christians or to cheer on Christians and say, hey, wouldn't it be great to live the Christian life? Wouldn't it be great if we just lived the Christian life with certainty and with confidence, knowing what we're doing is important? Do you realize what happens here at this church is more important than what happens in any arena in the United States this week? what happens at this church. No, I'm not saying a church of equivalent size. I'm saying what happens at this church and Bible preaching churches. What happens at churches this morning, this afternoon, and tonight is more important than any championship game the NFL can put on today. What happens on any Saturday when we have outreach, what happens anytime you take out a tract and give it to someone is more important than what happens at any arena, at any stadium, at any diamond, at any rink, anywhere in this country or anywhere in this world, because we can have confidence that when we do these things, we do it with certainty because God has called us to do this, and we should want to do it. We should desire to do it, and we should have confidence in it. But look at verse 28. We also have a higher concentration. Verse 27, I'm sorry, I keep being off there. But I keep under my body and bring it under subjection, lest that by any means when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. And that even goes up to verse number 25, and every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. He says, I keep under my body. That means this, I strike under the eye. I give it a black eye. I keep it under subjection. That literally means in the Greek to lead about as a slave. Paul made sure that his body was the servant and his inner man was the master. The desires and whims of his body were not going to rule over his entire self. Can you imagine what happened if someone was training for the Boston Marathon and they said this, I don't feel like training today. That's okay for a day. But what if you don't feel like training for a week? And you don't feel like training for a month? And you don't eat the food you know you're supposed to eat? And you don't do the exercise you know you're supposed to do? And you don't hit the benchmarks you know you're supposed to hit? Well, you can still run the Boston Marathon, but I would submit to you, you're probably not going to finish the Boston Marathon. Because you have allowed the whims of your body to control yourself. And so what Paul says here, he says, no, I want to keep my body. I want it to be in subjection. It is not the master. He says, I am the master, but I am not the master in and of my own self. I have to be controlled and guided by the Holy Spirit. He says, if I don't, I'll be a castaway. And that word castaway there doesn't mean that I will lose my salvation, but I would submit to you in the context of what we read, it means this. If you don't keep your body under subjection in the race of life, as in a marathon, you won't win a prize. And we will also lose prizes in heaven as well if we don't live the life that God calls us to live and run the race that God has called us to live. Verse 25, to be temperate in all things. That word temperate means moderate in the indulgence of the appetites or passions, as temperate in eating and drinking, temperate in pleasures, temperate in speech. We could almost put it this way from our message last week in Hebrews chapter 12, the weights. That we have to be careful knowing that we're running the race, that there are some things that just are not convenient, that are not expedient for us to run the race. I've got to be temperate. They're not sinful, but I just know I need to do what I can do because I've got a higher calling and I've got a higher purpose. And to live life saying the race is important, yet living differently means you're living as a castaway. Paul says this, I can't talk about how important this is for you to live right and then me not live right. I'll be a castaway. How much respect would you have for a pastor who would tell you, this is what you need to do, and then you found out during the week he didn't do any of the stuff he told you to do? I would say you probably have a lack of respect for him, as you well should. But how many times do we come in on Sunday and say, the Christian life is important to me. Being a disciple is important to me. The Bible is important to me. The Holy Spirit who lives inside of me is important to me. But then we walk out of here and we live in a way exactly opposite of that. We're on the way of being castaways, not losing our salvation, but losing the reward and losing the blessedness that God has prepared for us when we just live life in a way that we don't even consider that we have a race that's before us. So there's a higher purpose, a higher prize, a higher confidence, a higher concentration. But here's the question we have to ask ourselves, and I said it at the beginning of the message, and I want to bring it to you here as we finish this morning. Shouldn't a race with higher importance require a higher investment from those who run the race? Should a race with higher importance require a higher investment from those who run the race? Okay, here, let me help you with this. Let's say I'm going to run a 5K. And Derek is going to run a marathon. By the way, congratulations. Don't run him in those boots, though, okay? But I'm going to run a 5K, and Derek's going to run a marathon. Now imagine for that 5K, I trained day and night for a year. I'm up at 4 o'clock every morning. I'm out there running. I'm drinking raw eggs. Why? I don't know, because I think people do that. I'm doing everything I can. And then a week before, I'm making sure that I eat. I'm carbing up. I'm carb loading. I'm making sure that everything's good. I'm going to run that 5K. No, I'm not saying a 5K is not significant, but it's 3.1 miles. Most people can walk that, if nothing else. You might say this, Pastor, calm down a little bit. It's just a 5K. Like you had your year circulate around this 5K. Now imagine Derek's running this marathon, but does exactly the opposite of what I do. In fact, about a week or two before, he said, I probably ought to limber up a little bit. Probably ought to get ready. Probably should hydrate a little bit. Probably should get some things ready. And he treats the marathon like a 5K, and I've treated the 5K like a marathon. I would say that we both have missed the mark, haven't we? Why? Because we've not understood the importance of the race. And listen, if you've ever completed a 5K, that's a wonderful thing. I'm all for that. But let's not pretend that someone who has a 5K medal is equivalent to someone who has run a race and gotten a medal for a 26.2 mile race. They're not equivalent. I mean, even the numbers would tell you they're not equivalent. So the level of investment would be less for the 5K, by the very nature, than it should be of someone running a marathon, right? Right, great. Okay, we're on the same page. I didn't even give you time to answer. That's fine. Because I know the answer. We know what it is. Brother Dan, he works blocks from Heartbreak Hill. I get tired driving over it. And every time I drive near his work and drive around there, and I think of people going up that hill, which isn't really the biggest of hills, but it's just an incline that just seems like it's never going to end. And after already probably about 20 miles, by the time you get there, you probably feel like you want to give up. You probably hoped that you've taken this seriously by the time you get to Heartbreak Hill. Because if you haven't, you will be weeded out of the pack very quickly. So if we understand 5K, little importance, I should put less energy into it. Marathon, very important. I need to put more energy into it. What does it say about us? Hold on. What does it say about us as believers when we put very little energy and investment into the Christian race? To me, it says this. We have assigned it less importance. That it's not important in our day as it is our work. It's not as important in our day as it is our finances. It's not as important in our day as our own desires and our own will and our own dreams. When the Christian walk just seems to accidentally happen in our lives, the fact that we have put so little investment into it tells us we don't give it much importance. And that should be worrisome. And here's the reason why. Because we put all of our effort and all of our attention, if we're not careful, into things that are corruptible. Because that money in heaven, nobody cares how much you had in your bank account. We're not going to get to heaven and get to compare bank books with each other. If anyone has bank books anymore. We don't get to do that. We don't get to go to heaven and have a ledger of things that we owned and get to compare them with one another. But here's what we do get in heaven. Crowns. Crowns. That we get to cast back at Jesus' feet. And I can imagine that there at the judgment seat of Christ, nobody's going to be thinking, you know what, if I had just made another $100,000, life would have been so much sweeter. You know, if we'd just taken 2 more family vacations, things would have been so much better. You know what, if we had just had a second car, or if we just had a boat, or if we just had a cabin somewhere, things would have been so much better. And there's nothing wrong with those things in and of themselves if they have the right place in our heart. But what I am saying is this, no one at the finish line is going to worry about those corruptible things. Here's what we'll concern ourselves with. Did I run the race the way God had called me to run? Did I have the importance in front of me as I ran the race? And here's my concern, and I'm done. Here's my concern. If Tom Brady is willing to give up anything for one more Super Bowl, I think he's made it very clear that he is. If LeBron James is willing to completely devote his body playing NBA games, over 100 games a year for 20 years plus for another championship. If 60-year-old boxers will come out of retirement for one last fight, and we've all seen it before. if runners will get up at 3 a.m. for months just to run a single race, can't we as believers give a higher investment to the things of God so we can run the race that He would have us to run? If they will do it for something that doesn't matter in the light of eternity, can't we give full attention and investment and energy to the things that last for... You say, Pastor, I know what you're saying. You're saying, I need to be at church more. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. Oh, you're saying I need to tithe more. That's not what I'm saying. It's good to be at church. It's a right thing. I think it's a biblical thing. It's right to give. It's a biblical thing. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this. Am I giving lip service to something that's supposed to be a high and holy calling? Am I giving lip service to something that's supposed to be a high and holy calling? How do I know this? By the level of investment and importance I put into the race. That will indicate how I truly feel about the race that God's called me to run. They've said this: to see what's most important in someone's life, don't listen to what they say, check their checkbook. And there's probably some truth to that if you own a checkbook or a bank book. But I want to go even one step beyond that. If we want to see what's most important to us, what do we give the highest priority investment to in our life? And if it's to something corruptible, we've missed the mark. And it's not that those things aren't nice. It's not that they're not diversions at times. It's not that they can't be ways of relaxation at times. But if I'm to be temperate, if I'm to keep under my body and bring it under subjection, I must make sure that I'm doing the Christian walk, the Christian race, the Christian fight. Well, I don't like thinking of the Christian life like a fight. Well, listen, I'm not walking around like a boxer, but I do know this: He called it a fight. There are things worth fighting for in the Christian life. Am I willing to put the investment and energy into it? Or is it just lip service?
Thank you for listening to this sermon from the pulpit of Liberty Baptist Church. If this message was a blessing to you, or if there's any way we can serve you, please let us know by contacting us at info@mylibertybaptist.org, or you can visit us this Sunday at 800 Washington Street in Easton, Massachusetts. May the Lord bless you as you grow in His Word.